The 4th of June, 1942, dawned clear and cloudless over the Pacific Ocean. And Vice Admiral Nagumo Kiichi stood aboard the flagship carrier Akagi with the confidence of a man who believed he had already won. His strike force had just received word that American forces at Midway Atoll were reeling from the first Japanese aerial assault. Pilots returning to the carriers reported successful hits on installations, fuel depots burning, and minimal enemy resistance in the air. The mood among the Japanese command staff bordered on celebratory. After 6 months of unbroken victories across the Pacific, from Pearl Harbor to the Dutch East Indies, from Wake Island to the Indian Ocean, this appeared to be simply another demonstration of Japanese naval supremacy. The 4 carriers under Nagumo's command, the Akagi Kaga, Soryu, and Hairyu, represented the most powerful naval striking force ever assembled. Each flight deck buzzed with activity as deck crews prepared aircraft for a second wave against Midway. Nobody aboard these steel giants imagined that within 5 minutes, the entire course of the war would reverse itself in a catastrophe so sudden and complete that historians would debate its details for generations. The strategic importance of Midway had been debated in the highest circles of the Imperial Japanese Navy for months. Admiral Yamamoto Isoroku, the architect of the Pearl Harbor attack and commander of the combined fleet, had personally championed this operation. According to records examined by historians Samuel Eliot Morrison and John Keegan in their comprehensive analyses of the Pacific War, Yamamoto believed that capturing Midway would extend Japan's defensive perimeter and force the American Pacific Fleet into a decisive battle that would destroy it once and for all. The plan was ambitious, involving multiple task forces, diversionary attacks on the Aleutian Islands, and the commitment of nearly every major warship in the Japanese fleet. The operation represented Japan's attempt to knock America out of the war before American industrial capacity could turn the tide. Intelligence had suggested that the American carriers were elsewhere, possibly near Hawaii or even on the West Coast. Japanese reconnaissance had been thorough, or so the admirals believed. What Nagumo and his staff did not know was that American codebreakers at Station Hypo and Pearl Harbor had already deciphered Japanese naval codes. Commander Joseph Rochefort and his team of cryptanals had worked exhaustively to crack the Japanese J-25 code, determining not only that Midway was the target, but also the approximate date and composition of the attacking force. This intelligence breakthrough meant that instead of achieving surprise, the Japanese were steaming directly into an ambush. Admiral Chester Nimitz, Commander-in-Chief of the Pacific Fleet, had positioned his 3 available carriers, the Enterprise, Hornet, and Yorktown, northeast of Midway. The Yorktown had been damaged at the Battle of the Coral Sea just weeks earlier, but Pearl Harbor shipyard workers had accomplished near miraculous repairs in 72 hours, making her combat-ready despite structural damage that should have required months to fix. The American carriers waited in silence, their scout planes searching the vast ocean for the Japanese fleet. The first contact between opposing forces came not from carriers, but from Midway-based patrol aircraft. At approximately 5:30 on the morning of the 4th of June, a PBY Catalina flying boat spotted the Japanese fleet 200 miles northwest of Midway. The pilot radioed back the position, composition, and heading of the enemy force. Within minutes, every American aircraft capable of flight was launching from Midway's runways. The desperate defense included Marine Corps dive bombers, Army Air Force B-17 bombers, torpedo planes, and fighters. These aircraft, many flown by inexperienced pilots and obsolete machines, threw themselves at the Japanese fleet with more courage than coordination. The attacks were largely unsuccessful, with heavy American losses and minimal damage inflicted on the Japanese carriers. For Nagumo and his staff, these uncoordinated attacks simply confirmed their assessment that American forces were in disarray. The critical moment came at 7:15 when Nagumo received a troubling reconnaissance report. Scout plane from the cruiser Tone reported sighting what appeared to be American surface vessels to the northeast. The report was vague, incomplete, and maddeningly imprecise. It did not initially mention carriers. Nagumo faced a tactical dilemma that would haunt military academies for decades. His aircraft were being prepared for a second strike against Midway, with bombs suitable for land targets. If American carriers were present, he would need to rearm his aircraft with torpedoes and armor-piercing bombs designed for ship attack. Changing ordnance required time during which his fleet would be vulnerable. Nagumo hesitated, requesting clarification from the scout plane. Minutes ticked by with agonizing slowness. Finally, at 8:20, the scout confirmed the presence of what appeared to be American carriers. Nagumo immediately ordered his aircraft rearmed for naval attack. Flight decks became scenes of organized chaos as deck crews hastily removed land bombs and began attaching torpedoes. The removed ordnance was not properly stowed in armored magazines below decks, but left sitting on the hangar decks, a violation of safety protocols driven by the urgency of the situation. This decision would prove catastrophic. Meanwhile, American carrier aircraft were already airborne and searching for the Japanese fleet. The attack was poorly coordinated, with different squadrons arriving at different times from different directions. The first to attack were torpedo bomber squadrons from all three American carriers. These slow, obsolete TBD Devastator aircraft lumbered toward the Japanese fleet at wavetop height, making them easy targets for Japanese fighters and anti-aircraft fire. Torpedo Squadron 8 from the Hornet was completely annihilated, with only Ensign George Gay surviving, floating in the ocean to witness what came next. Torpedo Squadron 6 from Enterprise and Torpedo Squadron 3 from Yorktown met similar fates. Of 41 torpedo bombers that attacked, only 6 survived, and not a single torpedo found its target. Japanese fighter pilots and ship crews celebrated their defensive victory. The American attacks had been driven off with devastating losses. Nagumo's carriers had maneuvered successfully, avoiding every torpedo. The returning Japanese strike aircraft from the first Midway attack were being recovered, refueled, and rearmed. Within an hour, perhaps less, the Japanese counterattack against the American carriers would launch. Officers exchanged confident smiles. The battle appeared won. At precisely 10:12 on the morning of June 4th, 1942. The course of the Pacific War pivoted on a single moment of fortune so improbable that it seemed scripted by fate itself. Lieutenant Commander Wade McCluskey, leading Enterprise's bombing squadron, had been searching for the Japanese fleet for over an hour. His fuel was running critically low, and he faced the agonizing decision of whether to continue the search or return to his carrier. Then he spotted a lone Japanese destroyer, the Arashi, steaming at high speed. The destroyer had been delayed by depth charging the American submarine Nautilus, and now it was racing to rejoin the fleet. McCluskey made an intuitive decision to follow the destroyer's wake, gambling that it would lead him to the carriers. Minutes later, McCluskey's gamble paid off spectacularly. Breaking through scattered clouds, his pilots saw spread before them all for Japanese carriers. As their flight decks crowded with aircraft being fueled and armed, the sight was almost too perfect to believe. Due to the sacrificial attack by the torpedo bombers minutes earlier, Japanese combat air patrol fighters had been drawn down to wavetop altitude, leaving the high-altitude approach undefended. The Japanese were at their most vulnerable moment, with armed and fueled aircraft spotted on deck, fuel lines snaking across wooden planking, and ordnance stacked haphazardly throughout the hangar decks below. McCluskey split his force, directing his own squadron against the Kaga, while Lieutenant Richard Best's section attacked the Akagi, almost simultaneously. Dive bombers from the Yorktown, under Lieutenant Commander Maxwell Leslie, arrived over the target and selected the Soryu. The Americans pushed over into their dives, plummeting from 14,000 feet toward the enemy carriers below. Japanese lookouts shouted warnings, but it was too late. Anti-aircraft fire filled the sky, but the dive bombers came through it with grim determination. The first bomb struck Akagi near the amidships elevator at 10:16. Explosion detonated stored ordnance and sparked fuel fires that spread with horrifying speed. Within seconds, the flagship of the Nagumo force transformed from a symbol of Japanese naval might into a blazing inferno. Admiral Nagumo and his staff would eventually be forced to abandon ship, transferring to a cruiser. The Akagi, which had launched aircraft against Pearl Harbor, would never launch another plane. Kaga suffered even worse punishment, for bombs hit the massive carrier in rapid succession. Explosions tore through her flight deck, detonating the stored ordnance and igniting fuel lines. Secondary explosions rippled through the ship as magazines caught fire. The carrier's fire suppression systems proved inadequate against the scale of the conflagration. Within minutes, Kaga was dead in the water, her crew fighting, losing battle against flames that reached hundreds of feet into the sky. Soryu received 3 direct hits from Yorktown's dive bombers. Like her sister ships, she carried armed and fueled aircraft that transformed bomb hits into catastrophic explosions. The carrier's aviation fuel storage tanks ruptured, feeding the flames. Damage control parties fought valiantly, but the fires spread faster than they could contain them. The transformation from confidence to catastrophe occurred so rapidly that many Japanese sailors could scarcely comprehend what had happened. One moment, their carriers had been maneuvering smoothly, preparing to launch a devastating strike against the American fleet. The next moment, 3 of their 4 carriers were blazing wrecks, their flight decks twisted metal, their hangar decks transformed into blast furnaces. The carefully planned operation had collapsed in the span of 5 minutes. Officers who had been calculating attack vectors and fuel consumption now fought simply to survive as their ships died beneath them. Aboard Akagi, Captain Aoki, Taijiro, struggled to maintain order as fires spread through the flagship. The initial bomb hit had been devastating, but what followed was worse. The ordnance and fuel stored throughout the ship created a cascade of secondary explosions. Each detonation triggered others, and soon entire sections of the great carrier were inaccessible, cut off by walls of flame. Sailors trapped below decks faced horrific choices. Some attempted to reach the flight deck through smoke-filled passageways, many collapsing from heat and smoke inhalation. Others jumped from portholes into the sea, choosing the risk of drowning over certain death by fire. Admiral Nagumo initially refused to abandon his flagship, a decision that required urgent persuasion from his staff officers. Japanese naval tradition held that commanders should share the fate of their ships, but Nagumo's staff argued that his survival was essential for continued fleet operations. The admiral finally transferred to the light cruiser Nagara, watching in anguish as his flagship burned. The signal flags and radio equipment had been destroyed in the initial attack, leaving Nagumo temporarily unable to communicate with his scattered forces. For crucial hours, the Japanese fleet operated without centralized command, individual ship captains making decisions based on limited information. Kaga's death throes proved even more violent than Akagi's. The carrier had been built on a battleship hull, making her larger and more heavily built than modern carriers, but this structural strength proved useless against internal explosions. The force of detonating ordnance blew holes through her armored deck. Aviation fuel, stored in tanks throughout the ship, fed fires that reached temperatures capable of melting steel. The ship's commanding officer, Captain Okada Duzaku, was killed in the initial attack. Senior surviving officers attempted to organize firefighting efforts, but the scale of damage exceeded their capacity to respond. Pumps failed, water mains ruptured, and emergency equipment was destroyed or inaccessible. Sailors formed bucket brigades in a desperate attempt to contain the flames, but it was like fighting a volcano with cups of water. Soryu, the smallest of the fleet carriers, succumbed fastest. Her compact design, efficient in normal operations, became a liability as fire spread through confined spaces. 3 bomb hits in rapid succession had gutted her vitally. Captain Yanagimoto Ryosaku recognized that his ship was doomed within minutes of the attack. He ordered abandoned ship but refused to leave himself, choosing instead to go down with his vessel. Sailors reported seeing him on the bridge, singing traditional songs as flames consumed the ship around him. The carrier's navigator, Commander Ohara Hisashi, attempted to persuade the captain to evacuate, but Yanagimoto insisted that his place was with his ship. His decision reflected the Bushido code that permeated the Imperial Japanese Navy, a code that valued honor and tradition over survival. While 3 Japanese carriers burned, the 4th carrier, Hiryu, had escaped the initial American dive bomber attack. She had been steaming several miles north of her sister ships, a positioning choice made for operational flexibility that now proved providential. When word reached Hiryu's commander, Rear Admiral Yamaguchi Tamone, of the disaster that had befallen the other carriers, he immediately ordered his own strike force prepared for launch. Yamaguchi was considered one of the most aggressive and capable commanders in the Japanese Navy, a man who believed in taking initiative and striking hard. If his single carrier could damage or sink the American carriers, the battle might yet be salvaged. At 10:40, just minutes after the American dive bombers had departed, Hiryu launched 18 dive bombers and 6 fighters, every aircraft that could be quickly prepared. The strike was smaller than ideal, rushed, and improvised, but Yamaguchi understood that speed was essential. A second wave of torpedo bombers would follow as soon as they could be armed and spotted on deck. The commander of the first strike, Lieutenant Kobayashi Michio, led his formation southeast, following the rough bearing from which the American dive bombers had come. At noon, Kobayashi's formation spotted the American task force. The dive bombers pushed over into their attack runs, targeting the carrier Yorktown. American fighters rose to intercept, and anti-aircraft fire from the task force filled the sky with black bursts of shrapnel. Japanese aircraft began falling, shot down by wildcats or destroyed by anti-aircraft fire, but some broke through. 3 bombs struck Yorktown, penetrating her flight deck and exploding inside the ship. The carrier shuddered under the impacts, fires breaking out in multiple compartments. Damage control teams rushed to contain the blazes while engineers struggled to maintain power and propulsion. Despite the damage, Yorktown remained operational. Her damage control officer, Commander Clarence Aldrich, had trained his crews extensively, and their skills showed now. Firefighting teams extinguished the blazes with remarkable speed. Engineers jury-rigged repairs to damaged systems. Within an hour, the carrier was making speed and recovering aircraft. 2 Japanese scout planes observing from a distance, it appeared that Yorktown had been only lightly damaged, perhaps not hit at all. This misidentification would have significant consequences. At 2:30, Haryu launched her second strike, 10 torpedo bombers and 6 fighters. This represented virtually every operational aircraft remaining aboard the Japanese carrier. Lieutenant Tominaga Joichi led the formation despite his aircraft having been damaged in the morning strike against Midway. His fuel tank had been punctured. He knew he lacked sufficient fuel to return to Haryu. His decision to lead the mission despite this knowledge was another example of the self-sacrificial ethos that characterized Japanese naval aviation. The torpedo bombers found the American task force again, and this time they concentrated on what they believed was an undamaged carrier, which was actually the repaired Yorktown. American fighters and anti-aircraft fire took a terrible toll on the attackers, shooting down most of the Japanese aircraft, but 4 torpedo bombers survived long enough to launch their weapons. 2 torpedoes struck Yorktown on her port side, the underwater explosions rupturing fuel tanks and flooding engineering spaces. The carrier lost power and developed a severe list. This time, the damage proved too extensive for quick repairs. Even as Haryu's aircraft were attacking Yorktown, American forces were preparing their response. Scout planes from Enterprise had located Haryu by early afternoon. The carrier's position was radioed back to the American task force, and immediately a strike was prepared. Every available dive bomber from Enterprise, an orphaned aircraft from Yorktown, which had landed aboard Enterprise after their carrier was damaged, formed into an attack group. At 5 o'clock in the afternoon, they launched with a single objective: destroy the last remaining Japanese carrier. Lieutenant Commander Earl Gallagher led the strike force. The flight to the target took over an hour. Some pilots worried they might arrive to find Hiryu had retreated beyond range. Their concerns proved unfounded. At 6:15, they spotted the Japanese carrier steaming in company with her escorts but still within striking range. Haryu was in the process of recovering aircraft from her second strike against Yorktown, her flight deck crowded with planes being refueled and rearmed for yet another attack. The Americans had arrived at another perfect moment, catching the enemy at their most vulnerable. The dive bombers pushed over into their attacks. Anti-aircraft fire rose to meet them, and Japanese fighters attempted interceptions. But the Americans pressed home their attack with determination forged from the morning's success. 4 bombs struck Hiryu in rapid succession. As with the other carriers, the presence of fueled and armed aircraft transformed bomb hits into ship-killing catastrophes. Explosions ripped through the flight deck, igniting massive fires in the hangar deck below. Within minutes, Haryu was transformed from Japan's last hope to another floating inferno. Admiral Yamaguchi, watching his ship die around him, understood that the battle was lost. All 4 of Japan's fleet carriers were destroyed or dying, and with them went Japan's offensive capability in the Pacific. The admiral radioed a message to Admiral Yamamoto, commander of the combined fleet, informing him of the disaster and recommending that the invasion of Midway be cancelled. Yamaguchi then prepared to go down with his ship, a decision supported by his flag captain Kaku Tomio. Both men rejected entreaties from junior officers to abandon ship. They were last seen on Haryu's bridge, sharing sake and discussing poetry as flames approached. Japanese destroyers rescued hundreds of sailors from the burning carriers, but casualties were devastating. Kaga sank first, capsizing and slipping beneath the waves at 7:20 in the evening. Soryu followed at 7:13, her back broken by internal explosions. Akagi, the former flagship, lingered in agony until the following morning, when Japanese destroyers, unable to tow the burning hulk and unwilling to let her fall into American hands, torpedoed her. She sank at dawn on the 5th of June. Here you remained afloat longest, her crew fighting fires throughout the night, but by morning it was clear she could not be saved. The order was given to scuttle her, and she disappeared beneath the Pacific at 9 o'clock on the morning of June 5th. The tactical brilliance that had characterized Japanese naval operations for 6 months had failed catastrophically. The doctrine of concentrated carrier striking power, which had served so well at Pearl Harbor and in the Indian Ocean, had proven dangerously vulnerable. A few minutes of American dive bombers had accomplished what months of Allied resistance had not. They had broken the back of Japanese naval air power. Admiral Yamamoto Isoroku received reports of the disaster aboard his flagship Yamato, the world's largest battleship, which was steaming hundreds of miles behind Nagumo's carrier force. The architect of the Midway operation watched his carefully constructed plan collapse in real time through scattered radio reports. Initially, Yamamoto considered pressing forward, using his battleships to bombard Midway and force a night surface engagement with the American fleet. His staff debated the options throughout the night of June 4th, analyzing what forces remained and what objectives might still be achievable. Reality gradually imposed itself on Japanese planning. The 4 lost carriers represented more than just ships. They carried the irreplaceable core of Japan's naval aviation capability. Hundreds of highly trained pilots and aircrew had perished in the flames or been plucked from the ocean too injured to return to combat. The aircraft themselves, particularly the Zeros and Val dive bombers, represented months of production that could not be quickly replaced. Most critically, the momentum that had carried Japanese forces across the Pacific for 6 months had been shattered. The myth of Japanese invincibility, carefully cultivated through an unbroken string of victories, had been destroyed in 5 minutes of American dive bombers. By dawn on June 5th, Yamamoto accepted the inevitable and ordered a general withdrawal. The invasion of Midway was cancelled. The Aleutian diversionary operation, which had successfully occupied the islands of Attu and Kiska, suddenly seemed a hollow victory given the catastrophic losses in the Central Pacific. The combined fleet began its retreat toward Japan, destroyers screening the heavier units while submarines prowled the area hoping to catch American carriers. The American forces, aware that Japanese battleships still threatened the area and concerned about submarine attacks, did not pursue aggressively. Admiral Spruance, who had assumed tactical command after the morning attacks, decided that protecting Midway and preserving his remaining carriers took priority over pursuing a potentially dangerous night engagement. The final casualty of the battle came on June 7th, when the damaged Yorktown, under towback toward Pearl Harbor, was torpedoed by the Japanese submarine I-168. The carrier had remained afloat despite devastating damage, and salvage crews had been working to save her. The submarine's torpedoes struck both Yorktown and the destroyer Haman, which was alongside providing power and pumping services. Haman broke in half and sank within minutes, taking many of her crew with her. Yorktown, already mortally wounded, finally capsized and sank the following morning. Her loss was tragic, but did not diminish the American victory. 3 American carriers had defeated 4 Japanese carriers, sinking all 4, while losing only 1 of their own. The exchange rate, in terms of both ships and aircraft, heavily favored the Americans. News of the battle reached Washington and Tokyo almost simultaneously, though with vastly different receptions. In Washington, the victory was celebrated as the first major American naval success of the war. President Franklin Roosevelt understood the strategic implications immediately. The battle had halted Japanese expansion and provided a foundation for eventual American offensive operations. The victory vindicated the Navy's decision to prioritize carrier construction and validated the intelligence work that had made the ambush possible. Commander Rochefort and his cryptanalysis team, though they would not receive public recognition for years due to security concerns, were privately hailed as heroes who had won a battle before it was fought. In Tokyo, the news was suppressed. The Imperial Japanese Navy refused to acknowledge the scale of the disaster publicly. Survivors returning to Japan were quarantined and instructed not to discuss what had happened. Official announcements claimed a successful operation with minimal losses. The Japanese public would not learn the truth about Midway for years, though rumors circulated among those connected to naval personnel. Emperor Hirohito was briefed privately on the losses, and the news reportedly left him shaken. The emperor had supported the Pacific War with reluctance, and the Midway disaster confirmed his fears about Japan's ability to wage prolonged conflict against American industrial capacity. Behind the strategic analysis and tactical discussions lay human tragedy on an enormous scale. Thousands of Japanese sailors died at Midway, many in horrific circumstances. The fires that consumed the carriers left survivors with terrible burns, injuries that overwhelmed the medical facilities on rescue ships. Many sailors trapped below decks had no chance of escape, dying from smoke inhalation, burns, or drowning as compartments flooded. Others abandoned ship only to face hours or days floating in the Pacific, hoping for rescue before exhaustion, exposure, or sharks claimed them. Japanese destroyers worked tirelessly to recover survivors, their crews haunted by the cries of men floating in oil-slicked waters. The American losses, though proportionally smaller, were no less tragic for the families who received notification that their sons, husbands, or fathers would not return. The torpedo bomber squadrons had been virtually annihilated. Entire groups of young men who had trained together, formed friendships, and deployed together were wiped out in minutes of desperate attacks against overwhelming opposition. Their sacrifice, however, had not been in vain. By drawing Japanese fighters down to wave-top height, they had created the opportunity that allowed the dive bombers to attack unmolested. Military historians would later recognize the torpedo bomber crews as having made a crucial contribution to victory, though at a terrible cost. Ensign George Gay, the sole survivor of Torpedo Squadron 8, floated in the ocean for hours after his aircraft was shot down. From his position in the water, he witnessed the American dive bomber attack on the Japanese carriers, watching the great ships transform into burning wrecks. He later recalled the surreal experience of floating alone amid one of history's pivotal battles. Knowing his entire squadron had been lost, but seeing that their sacrifice had accomplished something meaningful, Gay was rescued the following day by a PBY patrol aircraft, suffering from exposure but alive. His testimony provided valuable intelligence about Japanese carrier operations and would become an important part of the battle's historical record. The aftermath of the battle presented Japanese commanders with agonizing decisions about survivors. Hundreds of sailors pulled from the water were severely burned or injured, requiring medical care beyond what shipboard facilities could provide. Japanese hospital ships and transports worked at capacity, but many men died during the voyage back to Japan despite the efforts of medical personnel. Those who survived often faced long recoveries and permanent disabilities. The psychological trauma affected survivors for decades. Men who had served aboard the proud carriers that struck Pearl Harbor now carried memories of seeing their ships consumed by fire, their shipmates dying in agony, and the invincible Japanese Navy revealed as vulnerable. For American survivors, particularly from Yorktown, the battle brought mixed emotions. They had won a great victory, but lost their ship and many shipmates. When Yorktown finally sank after submarine attack, many crew members who had fought to save her wept openly. Ships become more than steel and machinery to the sailors who serve aboard them. They become homes and communities. The carrier's loss felt personal. The destroyer Hammond's sinking was particularly tragic because it occurred days after the main battle, when many thought the danger had passed. Young sailors who had survived the battle died in the submarine attack, their families receiving notifications just as other families were celebrating the victory at Midway. The Battle of Midway fundamentally altered the strategic balance in the Pacific. Before Midway, Japan maintained offensive initiative, choosing when and where to strike. After Midway, Japan found itself on the defensive, reacting to American moves rather than dictating the pace of operations. The 4 lost carriers could not be quickly replaced, and even more critically, the experienced aircrew lost in the battle represented irreplaceable human capital. Japanese pilot training programs could produce new aviators, but they could not quickly replicate the experience gained through years of intensive training and combat operations. American strategy shifted from defensive operations to planning offensive campaigns. The victory at Midway provided breathing room for the American industrial base to begin producing ships and aircraft in massive quantities. Shipyards that had laid down new carriers before the war now worked around the clock to complete them. The Essex-class carriers, which would dominate the later Pacific War, were under construction. Light carriers and escort carriers joined the fleet in increasing numbers, American industrial capacity, which Yamamoto had always feared, began to manifest itself in ways that Japanese planners found alarming when intelligence reports reached Tokyo. The Japanese Navy faced difficult decisions about resource allocation and strategic priorities. Should they concentrate on rebuilding carrier forces or focus on defensive fortifications across their expanded perimeter? Should pilot training emphasize producing large numbers of adequate aviators or smaller numbers of highly trained experts? These debates consumed the naval general staff in the months following Midway. Different factions advocated different approaches, and the resulting compromises satisfied no one while consuming precious time and resources. Admiral Chester Nimitz, commanding the Pacific Fleet from his headquarters at Pearl Harbor, began planning offensive operations even as the battle's tactical details were still being analyzed. The victory had been decisive, but not war-winning. Japan still controlled vast territories and maintained powerful naval forces. The combined fleet retained its battleships, cruisers, and several light carriers. Japanese garrisons held islands throughout the Pacific, and the Japanese army remained a formidable force in China and Southeast Asia. Midway had stopped Japanese expansion, but rolling back that expansion would require sustained effort, resources, and American lives. The Guadalcanal Campaign, which began just 2 months after Midway in August of 1942, demonstrated that the Pacific War would be long and costly. American forces invaded the Solomon Islands to prevent Japanese construction of an airfield that would threaten supply lines to Australia. The campaign devolved into a 6-month battle of attrition that consumed resources on both sides. Naval engagements in the waters around Guadalcanal, collectively known as the Naval Battle of Guadalcanal, saw both sides suffer significant losses. The Japanese Navy fought with desperate courage, launching night attacks that exploited their superior training in night combat. American forces gradually adapted, learning from defeats and improving tactics. Throughout the Guadalcanal campaign and subsequent operations, the absence of the 4 carriers lost at Midway haunted Japanese planning. Operations that might have been supported by overwhelming carrier air power now required difficult choices about committing limited resources. Japanese commanders found themselves unable to achieve the concentration of force that had characterized their early war successes. The initiative that Midway had transferred to American forces proved difficult for Japan to recapture. The Battle of Midway transcended its immediate tactical results to become a defining moment in World War II and naval warfare history. Military academies worldwide study the battle as a masterclass in intelligence gathering, operational planning, and tactical execution. The battle demonstrated that technological superiority and numerical advantage could be overcome by superior intelligence and well-executed tactics. The American victory owed much to code-breaking, strategic positioning, and fortune, but also to the courage of aviators who pressed attacks despite heavy losses. The 5 minutes during which American dive bombers destroyed 3 Japanese carriers became arguably the most consequential 5 minutes in 20th century naval warfare. That brief window illustrated the vulnerability of surface forces to air attack and confirmed the carrier's dominance. As the capital ship of modern navies, the battleship, long considered the ultimate expression of naval power, was revealed as increasingly irrelevant in Pacific combat. Admiral Yamamoto's mighty Yamato and her sister ship Musashi, despite being the most powerful battleships ever built, never engaged in the decisive surface battle for which they had been designed. Both would eventually be sunk by aircraft, confirming lessons that Midway had taught. The intelligence success that enabled American victory at Midway vindicated investment in cryptanalysis and signals intelligence. Commander Joseph Rochefort's team at Station Hypo had cracked Japanese naval codes through painstaking analysis, mathematical skills, and intuition. Their work provided Admiral Nimitz with information about Japanese plans that proved decisive. The success led to expanded intelligence efforts throughout the war and established precedents for the intelligence community's role in military operations. Post-war organizations like the National Security Agency traced their lineage in part to the codebreakers who enabled victory at Midway. For Japan, Midway represented the beginning of a long retreat that would end 3 years later with atomic bombs, Soviet invasion, and surrender. The battle exposed limitations in Japanese strategic thinking, particularly the assumption that a series of quick victories would force American negotiation. Japanese planners had not adequately considered what would happen if America refused to negotiate, and instead committed its full industrial capacity to prolonged war. The decisive battle that Japan sought at Midway occurred, but with results opposite to those intended. Rather than destroying American naval power, Japan exhausted its own offensive capability. The human dimensions of Midway continued to resonate decades after the battle. Survivors on both sides carried memories of that June day in 1942. Japanese veterans, particularly those who had witnessed the destruction of their carriers, struggled with trauma that was often unacknowledged in a society that valued stoicism. American veterans became honored figures, their victory celebrated as a turning point that saved the Pacific. Annual reunions brought together dive bomber pilots, torpedo bomber survivors, and carrier crews who shared bonds forged in combat. As years passed and the veteran population dwindled, historians worked to preserve their testimonies and ensure future generations understood what had occurred in the waters northwest of Midway Atoll. The battle's lessons influenced naval doctrine, aircraft carrier design, and damage control procedures. American carriers incorporated better damage control equipment, improved firefighting systems, and more careful ordnance handling procedures. The vulnerability of carriers with armed and fueled aircraft on deck led to protocols, emphasizing the rapid clearing of flight decks and proper stowage of munitions. Naval aviators studied the tactics that had succeeded at Midway, particularly the coordination between torpedo bombers and dive bombers, even though that coordination had been accidental rather than planned. Midway stood as proof that wars are decided by people as much as by weapons or strategies. The codebreakers who deciphered Japanese plans, the intelligence officers who correctly interpreted fragmentary information, the admiral who positioned his carriers based on that intelligence, the dive bomber pilots who followed a destroyer's wake to find the enemy fleet, and the torpedo bomber crews who sacrificed themselves to create opportunity for others, all contributed to an outcome that seemed improbable before it happened and inevitable afterward. Those 5 minutes in June of 1942, when Japanese leaders believed Midway was won, only to watch 4 carriers sink into the Pacific, changed the course of the war and ultimately the course of history. The battle demonstrated that, in warfare as in life, fortune favors not just the prepared but the courageous, and that the distance between triumph and catastrophe can be measured not in miles or months, but in minutes.